Hi, and welcome back. Week 4. Today we're going to be talking about metadata, which is your data about your data, and how to record that, how to implement that in your studies, and how to publish it online. All right, let's get started. So there are lots of types of metadata and lots of types of data in general, and each have their best practices in terms of how to best format that data and potentially how to also record information about it. So here is a link to some metadata best practices, but I also encourage you to look up the data specifically that you work with a lot and think about the data types, how you're formatting it, and are you doing that in a way that is reproducible and fits with both things that you do in your own lab and things that other people who are using similar data also do. Okay, so now we're going to talk today about code booking and data dictionaries more intensively and what these are and how to keep them for your data. So code booking and data dictionaries are a house for all this information about metadata and your variables. Some things that before we get into it, I would just want to note here is that if you are doing scoring that is going beyond your raw data and abstracting data in some way, formatting it in a different way, combining different data, you will want some exact information about how and why that data was manipulated. And codebooks can provide a way to specifically identify how one item got to another item, or one variable name got to another variable, why you did that, and how that actually happened. I often keep my data dictionary and my codebook in a repository that is its own repository, and that is kind of a master for that project. So all of the analysis that goes on from a specific project starts from the same codebook so that we can harmonize across these different analysis projects the types of data and the place where it all started. So let's talk a little bit about the elements of a data dictionary and what goes in there. The first thing is your study metadata. So this is not about the specific variables, but about bigger elements of the study that you might be running. And so this includes all of the study procedures, the introduction, the background, some initial information about what the study is, how it was funded, who was involved with this, when did it start, all of this information that is really good background and really helpful if you are potentially, for instance, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line, wanting to use this data and you can't remember or don't have access to a lot of this information. So the study metadata and the introduction to the parent project, and then it also would house all of the key variables with easy to understand descriptions of what those variables are and what the data that they include is. This also could include, in addition to that easy to understand description of the data, links to the more specific scoring code, and that's where you're going to get in, that's where you could trace back, for instance, the exact variable that was the origin of the cleaned variable that you're using. And in an ideal world, right? And we don't often live in ideal worlds, but in an ideal world, you are creating a code book and a data dictionary in tandem with when you are at the very beginning of the project or as early as possible in that data collection or or data requisition if you're doing something that's secondary. But you are doing it as early as possible and only doing it once. And then going back to it, making tweaks, but really focused on that initial development of the data dictionary so that you're not repeating work, so that multiple people in the team are not repeating the same data cleaning processes and procedures and potentially even creating conflicts with one another. So again, when we're talking about rigor and reproducibility, if you have one master data set that you have done scoring scripts on, that you are going through the same cleaning pipeline, that's going to reduce the risk of having little inconsistencies across different projects, for instance. So how do we keep this all organized? Well, we have been working in these repositories, in these GitHub repositories, and we're going to really start to use them and use them in conjunction with one another when we talk about developing projects and repositories that are talking, if not talking to one another, in conversations with one another. So let's talk about repositories. The typical overall organization of a repository that I might be creating, whether it's a data cleaning repository, a codebook repository, or a more individual project repository, is going to be that you have this master, head of the repo, which is your file for your folder, and then within that you're going to have some initial files that might be Quarto files, gitignore files, other files that need to be in the main, the head of that repository. And then you'll have a lot of subfolders. And these subfolders will have some different things in them. They might include scripts. So in the repository that's on the right side of your screen here, that R folder, that is a folder that is just full of scripts. It's full of R scripts. They might also include some data, a data folder. You don't see a data folder here, and that's because I have included it in my gitignore file because I don't want to push it to GitHub because it's a private data that is just on my local machine. But on my local repository, I do have a data folder. You might also, as I do, have a folder of figures, a folder that includes environment things, and that's the R environment. Again, that R environment folder is made by the package. We don't have to do that much other than snapshot every once in a while to keep that updated. And then also some rendered documents folder. So those are some things that might be typical. You might have some other folders that I'm not listing here, but you can see those are each some separate separate information about your data, about the repository that you're doing here, that you're rendering here. And those are all working together, working in tandem to create either a code book or a project. Okay, so let's think schematically about these different repositories that you might have in a project and how they fit together. So your first repository that you're going to have and that I think about is my data cleaning repository. And your data cleaning repo is going to house your raw data, which again can be pushed to GitHub or can be pushed, but doesn't have to be. You can put that in the gitignore file and just have it in your local repo. And then it's also going to house your scoring scripts. And those are going to be things that you put in to that repo, but on your own, right? And then that raw data is going to pass through a scoring script, and that will create a clean data file. You don't put in that clean data file into the data cleaning repo. It is created by the combination of your raw data passing through the scoring script. But ultimately, it's still in that repository because it will get created if you do run the script. From there, once you have your data, you have this, okay, nice clean data, looks great. But if I'm just looking through some clean data, again, the thing that I aspire to the most as a researcher is that if I give someone data that they look at it and they're like, oh wow, I know it, this is what a joy. I got this and I know what's going on and I can understand the data. But if I just give them a raw data set with a bunch of variables, you're not going to understand much. And so we need a file to be able to interpret that. And that is where the codebook comes in. So that clean data file doesn't have to get passed to a codebook, but sometimes it's helpful. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the codebook repository will house that metadata that we talked about, that data about the study at a larger level. And it will also house some information, for instance, about the different measures, where they came from, some citations for those measures, and maybe some descriptives about the study, which you can, guess what, run from the clean data to get information about who's in your study and some basic details about the sample, for instance, if it's human subjects research. And then all of those Quarto files together can be rendered into a larger codebook. And we are going to dive into this a little bit more in depth in class to look at, okay, what does a rendered codebook actually look like? What are the pieces of it? And what might we want in a rendered codebook? So this is all on the data cleaning side. On the data analysis side, you can also pass your clean data over here. And in that, after you pass your clean data to a data analysis repo, you would then have, for instance, analysis scripts, some other QMD files that might be your introduction, your methods, and that can all come together to a rendered manuscript. So you might have, for individual project repositories, for a poster, for a paper, you might have different project repositories for any of those that might be looking at a different research question. But the idea is that you would only have one data cleaning repo and codebook repository for an entire study, an entire project. From there, you would then have multiple individual project repositories that would be going off of those initial data cleaning and codebook repositories. But we don't want to be repeating work. We don't want two analysts to be doing the same data cleaning work. And we really don't want two data analysts to be in conflict with one another, where they're cleaning the data in a somewhat different way. And so if we can align this early and keep all those scripts at the very least in one place, then we can harmonize our data better and make it more reproducible. All right. Last thing I'm just gonna hint at before we end for today is whether you should have your data in long format, wide format, or both. So this is a question as you're making that clean data file to just keep in mind, especially if you have a study with multiple time points or you have nested data. There are two different general forms that you can think about having your data in. A long format would have multiple rows for a single individual, and each row would represent a time point, for instance, but it would be a long in that if you have repeated measures, those would only be one variable going down a long ways, versus a wide format, you would only have one row for each participant, but you might have multiple columns for each of those repeated measures at different time points. There are, pros and cons to each format. It is more and more common that data is being used and manipulated and analyzed in long format, but there might be some use cases where you find that wide format works better for you as well. The question that you might want to ask here is, what's going to be the most common for the data use that you are doing? And knowing that you can do that pivoting later if you want to, but you might want to keep it in one form, the other form, or both in terms of your clean data. But if you do keep it in both, you're going to have to keep everything harmonized across both. So just another thing to think about as you are harmonizing and thinking about your data cleaning. All right, so wrapping up, we went through the idea of code booking, what it is, what it would include. It includes that study level metadata along with the metadata about your individual variables. And in a project, you would have one repository for your data cleaning scripts, you would have a repository for your code book, and then you would also have multiple individual project repositories that would go along with that. But your data cleaning repositories would only be done once for an entire study or project in an ideal world. All right. We'll get more into some details about this in class and do a practical when the next time I see you.